Welcome back to Let's Talk Politics. Today we're continuing our conversation with Eugene Lang on the fall of Trudeau's Liberals. In this episode, we'll dive into how Pierre Poilievre's Conservatives are capitalizing on the Liberal chaos and what this means for public perceptions of our democratic institutions. We'll also unpack the unfolding turmoil surrounding looming U.S. tariffs and share our predictions for Canada's next government. So, let's talk politics. So Pierre Poilievre is a really interesting character, and I think a lot of voters are still trying to figure him out, especially those who are undecided. On one hand, he's really mastered connecting with Canadians, often coming across as more relatable than Trudeau. His communications team, especially on social media, no matter what your political stripe is, he's doing a really effective job. You know, you can look at the memes of Justin Trudeau and Jagmeet Singh, and even his catchy slogans like just inflation and axe the tax. And I think a lot of people are intrigued by some of the economic and housing policies he's proposing. But here's where he loses me, is his messaging and tactics often veers into right-wing territory. And you can see him trying to appeal to that far-right base. And I think that's really off-putting for some undecided voters and maybe even more traditional conservatives. And I can point to, for instance, his YouTube channel. It included hidden misogynistic tags. He appeared on Jordan Peterson's podcast, which was sponsored by a pro-life organization. And over the holidays, he released an attack ad called Wacko, which was essentially mocking Liberal policies. On this same rhetoric, he was also kicked out of the House of Commons for calling the Prime Minister wacko last spring. So I'm just curious on what you think about these conservative tactics, especially with the element of social media, and have we seen attack ads like this before?
So I don't follow it on social media. I did know that he was thrown out of the House. Probably not the first leader of the opposition House. Wacko, I don't particularly like that kind of language and that kind of discourse. It seems to dominate politics these days. It's a very, very ugly discourse that's out there, I think, on all sides to a degree. Maybe worse on his side. I will say that he is a very effective opposition politician. He's been better at that than his predecessor in that party over the last number of years. Whether he can transfer those skills into being a decision maker, which is a lot different. You're not opposing, you're making decisions. That's the Prime Minister's job. Remains to be seen. Some opposition leaders have done that relatively well, others not so well, I think. Again, politics is an ugly sport. It's a contact sport, and the House of Commons, there's a long history of people getting thrown out. Apparently, Mr. Trudeau Sr., famously, I think it was in the late 70s, they used to refer to it as fuddle-duck. He used to use the F word in the House of Commons, apparently. This is before proceedings were broadcast. So, offensive language prevails. I think it is at another level right now. But again, it's partly the media, the social media that's driving this. It's the accelerant, it's the intensifier, I think. But it's also the character of the individuals.
And to your point, like it seems because now the House of Commons question period, all these pieces are more televised. The public has access to it. It's very intentional to get kicked out of the House just so they can show that clip. Look, the government's silencing me. And that's what scares me with the Conservatives, these like very manipulative tactics, in my opinion. Like before, I would argue it was if a prime minister or someone was using unparliamentary language, it was out of the passion of the debate. But it seems to be so much strategic now because they can just clip what they want and then feed it to their audiences. So it's just so fascinating to see. This might be a bit more of like a philosophical question, but do you think with these kind of tactics, getting kicked out of the House, filibustering, do you think this is impacting the public perception around the legitimacy of democratic institutions? Because I personally feel it's just very insulting when you're playing these games when we're trying to do business and pass important policies. I'm curious if you think that, because I feel like it's really delegitimizing it. And I think that's part of the conservative tactics.
Well, the legitimacy of our governing institutions has been on the decline for decades, and it's been tracked. over the years, not just here in all Western democracies. My impression is the public doesn't care at all about Parliament or know anything about Parliament. So I do think that kind of approach to politics debases our institutions over time. It has a corrosive effect on the public's view of these institutions, and it has an effect on the legitimacy of them. And just generally on politics. The public doesn't have much time for politicians. The public service isn't even trusted the way it once was. This is a huge problem. It should be a priority for a prime minister and a government to try and at least get on a different trajectory. You certainly can't turn that around overnight. It's been generations in the making. It's worth pointing out, though, that it's the government that sets the agenda in Parliament, and it's the government that sets the tone in Parliament. So we can blame the Conservatives for being the big part of the problem, but we also have to put some of the blame on the government. The Trudeau government's been in office for 9.5 years almost. So they have to take some of the blame for that as well, in my view.
Good points. And especially like what comes to mind as well is like government transparency. And this is something the Trudeau government really was like pushing for and trying to set themselves apart. But then we see scandals like SNC-Lavalin and the We scandal and some ministers giving contracts to their friends.
There's nothing new about scandals like that. I mean, I've been in governments where those things have happened too. And it usually happens after a government's been in office quite a long time, and they get sleepy and they get sloppy about these things. But I'm not absolving them of any of that. Those are all terrible things, but they do happen.
Absolutely. Going back to and parliamentary ruling, government's obviously in kind of caretaker mode with prorogation now, but Poilievre's still pushing for winning an election today. Are you aware, is there any parliamentary rule that can actually trigger an election while we're in prorogation, or is this just him kind of pandering for votes and fear-mongering?
You mean to go from a prorogation to a dissolution?
Yes.
Yeah. He wanted the opposition leaders to write to the Governor General to ask for a dissolution. I'm sure that advice would be ignored. The Governor General takes advice from the Prime Minister, not from the opposition leaders. What I do think will happen, or there's a good chance what will happen, is we won't see the prorogation to its conclusion on March 24th. I suspect after the new Liberal leader is chosen sometime between March 9th and March 24th, we'll likely ask for a dissolution of Parliament, the new Prime Minister, and will be granted a dissolution of Parliament, and we'll be into a general election. By the way, in 1984, when John Turner took over from Pierre Trudeau, John Turner did not have a seat in the House of Commons at the time. He'd been an MP and a senior minister, but he had been out of Parliament for 9 years. He won the Liberal leadership in 1984. 9 days later, he asked for a dissolution, and the election started. And that was not in a minority government. It was not during a prorogation, as I recall. And the government was not facing confidence votes that they were about to lose. It was a majority government that technically had about 18 months of mandate left. Because in those days, well, first of all, there was no fixed election date law. So a constitutional mandate is 5 years, and they were about 3.5 years in at that point. So that's one precedent you could point to for that sort of a scenario playing out. Mr. Carney, when I listened to him on The Daily Show, he kind of implied that's the route he would take if he became the leader. And I suspect he would in particular because he's not a sitting member of Parliament. It'd be very difficult, to my mind, to have a prime minister bring in a throne speech who isn't a sitting member of Parliament. I mean, it's not impossible. Don't get me wrong. It's constitutionally, it's not impossible, but it would be odd.
Mm-hmm. No, really, I didn't even think of that element, actually. So that's really...
I thought about it a lot. I mean, I thought, that's kind of strange that you'd bring in a throne speech and swear in a cabinet. I mean, Turner did swear in a cabinet, and he was not a sitting member of Parliament. But Turner is different. Turner had been a minister for a dozen years, way back. So he was known to the public as a political quantity, even though he'd been out of the game for 10 years. Carney is not that. So it would be a bit strange, but, it's not unconstitutional. He could choose to do that, and it would be perfectly all right from a constitutional standpoint. Politically, it might be a bit awkward and odd. I mean, he wouldn't have a seat in the House of Commons, for example. He wouldn't be able to debate the throne speech that he's just brought in. And that would be very strange, I think.
Yeah, I think just optically as well. And people obviously don't know all the nuances of constitutional rule and Westminster system.
I remember, it wasn't of this gravity, but in the late 90s, Joe Clark became leader of the Progressive Conservative Party. And he didn't have a seat in the House of Commons for about 18 months. And he'd been a former prime minister. It was a huge problem for the Conservative Party that he didn't have a seat because he couldn't generate a by-election. The government had to grant him that. He had to wait to the general election.
Mm. And on that note, too, as we're talking about like elections coming up, originally Poilievre was primed to take on Trudeau. And it's funny because I think, Trudeau and Poilievre are career politicians. They don't really have market experience. Neither of them really know what the working class deals with. That being said, do you think because Poilievre's not facing Trudeau, he's feeling a bit threatened with the potential Liberal leaders? The reason why I say this is the Conservatives were very early on trying to discredit Carney, calling him carbon tax Carney. They're trying it now with Freeland, calling her, I think Christia Carbon or something. But both Freeland and Carney have publicly said that they're going to be axing the tax. But do you think he feels a bit threatened, or do you think this adds a new element to his strategy?
I don't know if he's feeling threatened by the Alternatives, but I do know that they had geared their whole campaign around fighting Trudeau. And that's changed, obviously. So they have to reconfigure their campaign if they're running against somebody who wasn't part of the Trudeau government, the case of Carney. I think, though, they're really fighting the last war on this carbon tax stuff. Like, I really don't think that's going to be the central issue in the campaign. I mean, there's a larger set of issues around affordability that plays into, for sure. But I really do not see the majority of Canadians voting on the basis of the carbon tax. Maybe I've got that completely wrong. But when I look at opinion surveys that rank the issues, the priorities for Canadians, at the very top of the list is healthcare. Affordability is at the top of the list. That's not the carbon tax. That's one element. Carbon tax may well be contributing to affordability problems, and the public may perceive that to some degree, but that's not the only dimension of it. They want it to be about the carbon tax, but I don't think it's going to be, especially with Trump coming in and whatever he does. By the time we get to an election, if it's, let's say, late April, I imagine a lot of the focal points going to be on the United States, and it's going to be on Trump, and it's going to be on dealing with those sets of issues which have absolutely nothing to do with the carbon tax.
We're recording this today on Trump's second inauguration, January 20th, 2025. How do you feel Canada has been handling the threats of tariffs coming from Trump and his administration?
I mean, this isn't like the NAFTA where there was a required renegotiation at a certain point in time. That's coming up again in 2026, but this is different. He's going to impose these tariffs. He's going to demand certain things, and maybe he'll sit down and talk them through with whoever the government is. It's a very bad situation, and it didn't need to be this way. We knew this months ago. We knew this was coming. He was talking about it all through the campaign, if anybody was paying any attention. I think everybody was just blowing it off. The degree to which Mr. Trump holds tariffs with great conviction. He believes in the economics of tariffs, period. You're not going to convince him that free market works. He doesn't believe in free trade. He believes in an asymmetric trading relationship where the United States has power over its trading partners, and you achieve that power through your market dominance and your tariffs. That's his worldview, and we better wake up to that.
I take your point and 100% agree with them. All that being said, as we're kind of wrapping up, I'm just curious if you have any predictions of what the next election or next few months, do you think things are going to play out?
My predictions almost invariably are wrong, but if you want my prediction, right now I would say it looks like Mark Carney's likely going to win this leadership. But I was involved in a leadership in 2006 where nobody thought Stéphane Dion was going to win. It was either going to be Michael Ignatius or Bob Rae's crown. And at the end of that day, Stéphane Dion won. And that's not the first time that's happened. So who knows who's going to win? Right now, the polls show the Conservatives with a commanding lead, although there are some polls that are starting to show a bit of a narrowing. The question is, how damaged is the Liberal brand? You said earlier you're convinced it's badly damaged. I was convinced of that, but I'm not so sure. Like maybe there is a residual brand strength there that can be revived a little bit under another candidate, but I don't know. I think it could be anywhere from a Conservative minority to a massive majority. I don't see a Liberal minority at this time, but, things can change very rapidly in politics. And often do. And if a candidate really takes off and takes hold suddenly for some reason, the dynamic can change pretty quickly. Just look at the late phenomenon 2011. Nobody ever thought the NDP would win like that in Quebec. I mean, he's not even francophone. And I think they won 40 seats in Quebec or something like that. Nobody saw that. Nobody thought in 1993 the Bloc Québécois would be the official opposition. Certainly nobody thought in 1993 a majority government would be reduced to 2 seats. So you never know. And that's why I'm very reluctant to make prognostications, because every time I do, I'm proven resoundingly wrong. But if I had to bet money, I'd probably bet on Carney winning a Conservative government, probably a majority.
Yeah, I would agree with you as well. Like, it's just based on the door knocking I've done. And the frustration, I think, with the Liberal Party, because, I would say mainly in the 905, less the 416. The 416, I think a lot of ridings might flip NDP, just with the frustration with the Liberals. It really depends on the candidates. Like, there's so many factors at play. But just hearing from the pressure on the middle and upper class with taxation in the 905, on Ontario specifically, has been really, really tough. And I'm telling you, it's almost every other house where I live that has an F Trudeau flag out.
If you start to see that, though, in the 416, then it's game over. I'll say this as a final thought on that. The Liberal Party of Canada cannot form a government unless it wins a lot of seats in the 416 in Toronto and in Montreal. And that's why those 2 by-elections were so significant to me. That stronghold has now been broken into in the 416 for the first time in 35 years, and they lost that seat in Montreal. If they can't do well, not just win seats, but dominate in the 416 and in Montreal, they can't form a government.
Yeah, it definitely, and it's interesting because you're seeing Poilievre's tactics. I don't know if you've been following it closely, but trying to really hone in on Quebec. He spends a lot of time in the 905. I've been following his campaign, but he even took an attack on Carney on Twitter, poking at his Frenchability and making fun of him for doing his soft launch on an American show, only in English.
Well, that's the other issue that's, I think, going a little bit under discussed. Is this the first time the Liberal Party, to my memory, where you don't have a serious francophone candidate from Quebec, number one. Number two, from what I understand, neither Carney or Freeland speak particularly fluent French, or at least the kind of French that is normally the standard in the Liberal Party. Neither one of them have ever lived in Quebec, to my knowledge, and I don't think either one of them know much about Quebec, to be honest, either. During the period of the real turmoil in Quebec in the 1990s through the Charlottetown and Meech Accords, the 1995 referendum, and so on, they weren't in Canada, as far as I know, during that period. Now, you can follow it from outside, but as you know, it's a little different when you're here. And Poilievre was too young to remember a lot of that stuff, I guess. And, the PQ is poised to win again, I guess, in Quebec, and the Bloc might end up as the official opposition again. History repeats itself. And we could be walking into a national unity crisis in Quebec. Forget about Alberta and forget about what's going on south of the border. Throughout my childhood and until I was in my 30s, that was a dominant issue in Canada. I think it's all gone away. It never really goes away. And we better keep an eye on that situation as well. So there is sort of polycrises, as they say, going on, or nascent polycrises. And that's one I worry a bit about.
It's definitely like one of those quiet issues, or don't think it is until it kind of blows up in your face.
Well, that's what the separatists want. They don't want it to be front and center. They want to just suddenly wake up one day and you got a PQ government in Quebec and they're going to have a referendum and, support for separatism's gone up for some reason. And, I think the most skillful politician on the federal scene, by the way, is the leader of the Bloc.
Yeah, I agree with you on that. He's just been kind of in the background and saying when he has his opportunities, but otherwise not really ruffling feathers.
He's very skilled, very effective, and appealing. But you look at that guy and you think, well, okay, he's a serious politician in some ways, and in a way that the others really are not.
That's what I think is so interesting with the dynamic of politics, is you can vote on just like the personality of the person and being interested in them. I don't know if it's a shame, totally different tangent, that we don't have the opportunity to actually vote for the prime minister in the similar system as the states, because even just, again, door knocking and explaining to people you vote for your local representative, that vote goes to the leader. What would your take be on that? Do you think we would ever get to that point in Canada?
No. And there's a profound ignorance in Canada about our whole system, even though we've had it forever. We don't elect a government in Canada. We elect the House of Commons. The House of Commons chooses the government. We don't elect prime ministers, as you say. And I don't think we'll ever get to a system like that. And I'm not sure I would even want a system like that, but I'm not sure we'll ever get any electoral reform.
Yeah.
This is one of the issues Mr. Trudeau famously ran on to some degree and talked a lot about it when he was in opposition and never came close to delivering on.
Yeah, he did say in one of his recent interviews as well, that was one of his regrets, which I still don't understand when you've been in power for so long, that it's not something that I don't even recall even being brought up as like a bill.
But it wasn't. He said recently that it was one of his regrets, and he said that he couldn't get it done because it would have been wrong if he was to do that without support from at least one of the opposition parties. It's funny, he doesn't tend to think that way on any other issue, but he thinks that way on that one, which is fine. And that means you have to be willing to give and take on the model that you want. And my recollection is he wasn't willing to give and take on the model that he wanted. And the opposition didn't like that model because they thought it favored the Liberals. So it wasn't a good faith effort on his part, in my view. And that's why we didn't get electoral reform. It's kind of like him blaming the conflicts with the party for the reason that he's leaving and not taking any responsibility for that. That's his fault. Same thing on electoral reform. That's his fault. He could have got there if he was willing to give and take and negotiate with the opposition parties, or he could have just moved the bill through Parliament when he had a majority. Chose to do neither.
Definitely two options were front and center and not explored. Eugene, I want to thank you so much for being here on the podcast. You're assistant professor at Queen's University School of Policy Studies, and I have the privilege of being your student and going through that program. And I just want to take a moment to say how amazing the Master's of Public Administration was. It really changed the course of my career, my life, and just even skills of understanding how government works. And I always joke to people, I'm trained like a bureaucrat, but think like a politician, just with my practical experience and also through my academic experience. So it's a great program, and I'm so happy to have the privilege of working with professors like yourself and other hands-on professors, because I think that we don't get that opportunity a lot in schools. I also want to give a shout out to Kathy Brock and Professor Don Drummond. Really fantastic, and it's so cool to see you guys also in the real world and doing CBC interviews and still engaging in discourse. So I want to thank you for your service, both public service and service as a professor, and staying in contact with students, because it really makes a difference, I think, and hopefully pushes the policy agenda in certain ways, whatever that looks like. But thank you so much for being here and taking the time.
Well, it's very kind of you. We need all the support we can get down at Queen's, so thank you very much. So that's nice to hear. And it was my pleasure doing this. I really enjoyed our conversation.
That wraps up our two-part episode on the fall of Trudeau's Liberals with Eugene Lang. Be sure to tune in next week as the political drama continues to unfold. I'm your host, Julia Pinella. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time on Let's Talk Politics.